Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Tonight, you are listening to a calm, short version of The Death of Empedocles, a fragmentary dramatic work by Friedrich Hölderlin, written between 1797 and 1800. It is the story of a man who was once revered like a demigod and later cast out like a criminal. A story about power and gratitude, pride and solitude, and about what happens when a human being is no longer willing to remain part of the world that once celebrated him. For a long time, Empedocles stood at the center of his city. People listened when he spoke. They believed him when he healed. He understood nature as few others did, and spoke of the forces of the earth, of fire and water, of life and decay. And many believed he stood closer to the gods than to human beings. Yet precisely this marked the beginning of his fall. The greater his reputation grew, the quieter resistance became. People began to whisper, then to doubt, and finally to fear. Was Empedocles still human, or had he begun to believe himself something more? Was his wisdom humility or arrogance? Had too much power been placed in the hands of a single individual? When the mood turned against him, it did not happen loudly or suddenly. It was a decision made in the background, a political act presented as protection. Empedocles was banished from the city, not for a crime, but because his existence had become inconvenient. The once revered figure left the community alone. He withdrew far from the people and lived in silence. But this silence was not peace. Within him worked the injury, the disappointment, and perhaps also the realization that his closeness to people had always been a misunderstanding. He had wanted to bring them truth. They had expected admiration. And when admiration turned into fear, there was no longer any place for him. Meanwhile, the city changed. Without Empedocles, illnesses appeared, harvests failed, uncertainty spread. People began to wonder whether they had made a mistake, whether they had cast out the one who once protected them. Slowly, the desire for his return grew. But Empedocles was no longer the man who had left. The call to return. The news of the city's troubles did not reach Empedocles immediately. At first, only rumors reached him, of spoiled harvests, of illness, of unrest that could not be explained. Over time, however, the voices became clearer. His name was spoken again, first quietly, then openly. People remembered the time when Empedocles had lived among them, his certainty, his clarity, his ability to bring order to the chaos of the world. What they had once perceived as arrogance now appeared to them as strength, and what they had expelled now seemed necessary. Messengers were sent. They found Empedocles far from the city, withdrawn, almost detached. He listened without interrupting as they spoke of hardship, fear, and the desire for reconciliation. The city, they said, was ready to take him back. More than that, it wished to honor him again, to give him a leading role, perhaps even more power than before. But Empedocles responded differently than they expected. He showed neither satisfaction nor anger. Instead, there was a distance in his gaze that unsettled them, as if he had already left behind the world from which they came. He spoke of the community as something transient, of human ingratitude and weakness, not accusingly, but matter-of-factly. The city, he said, had not cast him out because he was wrong, but because it could no longer bear his presence, because it had felt too small beside someone who thought beyond it. and therein lay the decisive point. Empedocles sensed that a return would heal nothing, neither for him nor for the others. The people wanted him back because they needed him, not because they understood him. And he knew that if he returned, the cycle would repeat itself. Admiration would again turn into fear, proximity again into rejection. In this realization, a resolve began to grow within him, one he himself only slowly began to grasp. He had separated himself from humanity not out of hatred, but out of clarity. After the messengers departed, Empedocles remained alone, yet the city did not release him. Even in absence, it remained present, its voices, expectations, and demands echoing within him, not as longing, but as something he wished to leave behind for good. He began to see himself differently. For a long time he had believed he spoke to people as one of them, only with greater knowledge and responsibility. Now he recognized that for them, he had long since become a figure, a symbol, a projection. No longer a human being, but a screen onto which they cast what they themselves were not. They had elevated him for this, and then cast him out. This realization brought no bitterness, but a peculiar calm. Empedocles reflected on the order of the world, on the relationship between human beings and nature, on what comes into being and what passes away, and on the fact that everything living ultimately returns to the whole. For him, this was not theory, but certainty. The clearer this became, the stranger the idea of returning to political order appeared. Laws, offices, power, all of this seemed small compared to the forces he recognized in nature. The city demanded leadership. Empedocles sought dissolution. At the same time, the myth around him grew. Rumors spread that Empedocles was more than human. Some said he had left deliberately to prove his divinity. Others believed he would one day return, greater and more powerful than before. The farther he withdrew, the larger his shadow became. But Empedocles felt something else. The boundary. The boundary between what a human being can be and what he must not become without losing himself. He had touched this boundary, perhaps crossed it, and now knew there was no return. Not out of defiance, not out of pride, but because a life between veneration and banishment was no longer a life at all. Within him, a thought took shape, at first quietly, then with growing certainty. If there was no place left for him among people, then he would have to go where all distinctions ended. The longer Empedocles remained alone, the clearer it became that his decision was approaching inevitably. The thoughts that surrounded him were not new, only their consequence was. What had once been theory now demanded action. He remembered the city without nostalgia, but with sober clarity. The places where people had listened to him, the faces that changed the moment doubt arose. He realized that the community had never sought truth, but security, and that he, who had embodied that security, became dangerous the moment he withdrew from it. In the distance, he saw Mount Etna. The volcano was more than a place to him. It was a symbol of what had long occupied his thinking: origin and end, destruction and renewal. Where fire broke from the earth, where solidity dissolved, he saw the principle that governed all life. No permanence, no possession, no power, only transformation. Empedocles began to prepare his path there, not hastily, not like someone fleeing, but with the calm of a person who knows where he is going. He no longer spoke of return nor of future. All that still concerned him was whether his final step would be understood or misunderstood once again. For he knew that people would interpret his decision. Some would revere him as a god, others dismiss him as mad. But none of these interpretations would concern him anymore. For the first time, Empedocles felt no tension between himself and the world, no expectation, no demand. He had stopped playing a role. The thought of death did not frighten him. It appeared as a return to what had always been greater than himself, not as punishment, not as sacrifice, but as the consequence of a life that had found no place among human beings. When Empedocles set out toward Etna, he did so alone. Not because no one would have followed him, but because this was not a path that could be shared. It was not a departure toward a new community, but a farewell to all community. The closer he came to the volcano, the stronger the calm within him grew, not the calm of exhaustion, but of alignment. For the first time in a long while, thought and action no longer stood in contradiction. Everything he had recognized required no further proof. Along the way, he thought of the people he had left behind, their fear of losing control, their longing for guidance. He did not condemn them. He understood them. And precisely this understanding made return impossible. For he knew they would never accept him as an equal. Either they would elevate him or banish him. There was no space in between. Empedocles was weary of this alternative. All his life he had tried to explain the order of the world, to make it comprehensible. Now he recognized that the greatest order lay in surrendering to it, not in resignation, but in completion. The volcano lay clearly before him now. The ground beneath his feet was warm, the air heavy. It was not a hostile place, not threatening. To Empedocles, it felt familiar, almost welcoming. A place that demanded nothing and promised nothing. Here, there were no judgments, no applause, no hatred, no expectations. Empedocles paused and looked back once more, not at the city, but at his life. He saw no error he could have corrected, only a consequence he now accepted. He knew his death would be interpreted as greatness or madness, but for him, it was neither. It was the final, logical step of a path that had begun long ago when he was first revered. As Empedocles approached the crater, his perception shifted. The sounds of the world receded as though losing meaning. Wind, the rumbling of the earth, even his own breath became part of a single, steady rhythm. Yet he did not fully escape humanity. In his thoughts appeared those who had once celebrated him, those who had cast him out, and those who wished to bring him back. He recognized that they had all done the same thing. They had used him to organize their own insecurity. As long as he provided answers, he was welcome. The moment he became greater than their questions, he became dangerous. Empedocles wondered whether it could ever have been different, whether a human being with his knowledge and view of the world could ever have remained without becoming ruler or outcast. But the question quickly lost its sharpness. The time of possibilities lay behind him. What remained was clarity. He felt no defiance, no desire for revenge, no urge to set an example. If he went now, it was not to instruct humanity, but to remain true to himself. He did not wish to continue living as an exception, as a myth, as a warning. He wished to disappear. Not into oblivion, but into the whole. The rim of the crater lay before him. The heat intensified, the light changed. Here there were no words left to explain anything, no language sufficient to describe what he felt, only the knowledge that every further step was irreversible. And yet, he did not hesitate. Not because he sought death, but because he had lived life as it was possible for him, to its end. Empedocles stood at the edge of the crater. Beneath him moved the fire of the earth, unceasing and indifferent to all that was human. There was no longer fear, no final doubt that might pull him back. What lay before him was not an abyss, it was dissolution. He no longer thought of fame, guilt, or the judgment of people. All of this had concerned him only as long as he was part of their order. Now that he had left it, their measures lost meaning. He had understood that his life had been trapped between veneration and banishment, and that there had been no third state. The world, as people wanted it, had no place for him. Empedocles had long believed he could resolve this contradiction by enlightening people, bringing them truth. In the end, he recognized that insight is not always desired, and that those who see too far often remain alone. His death was no protest, no accusation, no sacrifice. It was consequence. With the final step, Empedocles released himself from everything that had defined him: name, role, expectation, memory. In the moment he fell, he became part of what he had always described: the eternal movement of becoming and passing away. What remained was the story. People would say Empedocles had been a god. Others would say he was mad. Still others would see a warning in his death. Yet all these interpretations revealed more about the storytellers than about the man himself. Empedocles had not wanted to die. He had simply no longer been willing to live under conditions that denied him. And so his path ended where no judgments are passed. And with that, today's story comes to an end. Perhaps you are now wondering, how does our calm short version differ from Hölderlin's fragmentary original? Why did Empedocles consciously refuse to return, even when power and honor were offered to him? And what does this story reveal about the tension between community and individuality, then and now? We explore these and other questions in our accompanying book, Golden Pages, Volume 3. There, we place the death of Empedocles in its historical and philosophical context, and show why this fragment continues to have such lasting power. You will find the link in the description. And if you like, we will listen to each other again tomorrow on Sleepy Classic Tales. Good night.